Our next session is Managing and Protecting Your Personal Records by Christine Garrett. Christine has been with the Georgia Archives since 2014 and is the records management officer. In this role, she oversees the records management section, including local government records, state government records, electronic records, and the State History Center, Records Center, I'm sorry. She has a BA in history from Randolph-Macon Women's College and an MA in history with a concentration in archival studies from Auburn University. Thank you.
So, War Eagle.
War Eagle.
We're going to cheer for the right Tigers today. Okay. Okay. So can everybody hear me? And my echo? Why isn't this wanting to do this? Okay, I'm not sure why this slide thing is not working. Oh wait, never mind. I'm having a no. Okay, hold on. I'm having a moment. I apologize. Advancing without me wanting it to. Oh well, we'll start here. We'll see what happens. So this slide is fine. Okay. So you just missed my opening slide, which basically Kayla just gave you all that info. So yes, I oversee records management, and I'm going to torment you a little bit about records management. But we're going to have genealogy records will be included in here. But we will get to that in a bit. So why we manage records. And when I talk about records, I'm talking about all of your records, not just genealogy records, but your household records, bills, manuals, medical records, and all that. So you want to manage it to reduce cost. So if you keep everything you have, all the records you've ever gotten, every paycheck stub, return check, all of that, and you move, your moving bill would be a whole lot more than somebody who just kept what they needed to do or what needed to keep. I know somebody who moved and his moving bill was like $10,000 less than somebody who kept everything. Now you might not be moving soon, might not be moving again, but that's just one example. If you don't keep track of your records, you might be late on bills, which then affects your credit. You have to pay extra fees. You might miss a doctor's appointment. And if you miss a doctor's appointment, of course, you have to pay extra. You also have to pay for extra storage, whether it's electronic with all the storage media or just supplies. You reduce your liability. If for some reason the IRS decides that you are one of the lucky ones that they're going to audit, you only want to have the records that they absolutely require. I'm not going to go into all the details about that, about what they require, but you're not required to keep all of your tax returns. But if you have them, they can go through that. So you want to make sure you only have what you need. Not that you're doing anything wrong, but the more information you give them, the less you just don't want to give them that much information. It can reduce stress. Now, some people do well in environments like this where everything's a mess. Personally, I do not. I like order where I can find things. And if your records are like this, you might not be able to, oh, thank you, Henry. That's fine. You might not be able to find things so easily. So for example, my daughter, she used to keep her room a mess. She loved it a mess. And she said, I know where things are. Then why did we not go to a soccer game because you couldn't find your soccer shirt? And you didn't find it for like another year. It had fallen behind, you know, when you open your drawers and sometimes things will get back there. So if you can't find something, at least that's stressful for me. And you can protect your records from premature loss. So say this is your desk, and this is how you keep your records. You have a cup there, and it looks like it has coffee, which could easily just damage the records there. I can personally attest that having coffee, or in my case, Coke, spilled into your laptop is not good. And you can things get damaged, they get lost. And when you lose things prematurely, again, you might miss out on bills, you might miss out on appointments, you just don't have what you need. And for some reason, it's not advancing. Penny, do you know why it's not being nice to me? Why you manage your slideshow so it does work for you. Wait, hold on. What does this button do? Okay.
We can use these.
Okay, it had resumed slideshow, so I think I might have just need to push something.
Excuse me a second.
I know how to use PowerPoint, except for when I present and then something happens. I did a presentation once. I have all my notes written in the note field, so if something happens, somebody else can read them, or if I forget what I'm speaking about, I can just read from it. And I had a presentation when we couldn't get it to do this, so we had my notes all up there. So I was basically reading to them what I was saying.
Zoom. So you have to just do this. Did you need to zoom up on something?
Oh no,
Okay.
I just needed to advance.
Yeah, like this right here?
Yes.
Just
For some reason that wasn't working a few minutes ago, but now
this
you have the power.
This is right there.
Yeah.
This is working on the computer.
Okay,
And Hendrik took care of that problem.
yes. Okay. Ready to roll.
Yes, so we're back onto this. So what is records management? If you really want something not fun to do and you want to go to sleep at night, you can go into the Code of Georgia and read its nice long definition. It'll put you to sleep. Basically, creating, storing, protecting, accessing, and disposing of your records from when they're created until you finally get rid of them. And finally, getting rid of them can, like with genealogy records, you're not getting rid of those, you're saving them. So that's your permanent retention is that, but you might be getting rid of bills or you can dispose of them after a while. Records must remain authentic, usable, and accessible from when they're created until when you finally get rid of them. So some people like to scan all the paper records they get in, they scan their bills and just store them that way. You want to be able to show that that bill you scanned is an authentic representation of what that paper originally was. And there are ways to do this, but I'm not, unless you're really interested in that, I'm not going to get into details. It's about hashes and all that. But we're going to go to the next thing. So, how to, yeah, Penny, it really doesn't, where did Penny go? What? Oh, hold on. Maybe it's this again. It keeps, okay, see what it does is up here, it'll start saying resume. It does that and then,
Okay.
I don't know.
Okay.
I'm not using this laptop to manage my records. So you always have to have cats and or some cute animals. So what's in your records box? In my case, I have my cat Zebra. Hopefully he's not in my records box because he eats things. He likes to eat paper. I will say one day I had my file cabinet drawer open and he was doing this pawing thing and he actually pulled out a record and it happened to be his vet record, which I thought was fun and a little scary. Like, how did you know that? But you want to know what's in your records boxes. So you want to have what we call intellectual and physical control over your records, which is just fancy for saying what you want to know what you have and where it is. Because you can't manage something if you don't know where it is, what you have. So you want to organize your records. Does everybody know where all their records are and how they're all organized? Or do you just have, okay, I won't make you raise your hands or anything. So it's okay to have records in multiple locations. For example, if you have manuals to your kitchen appliances, does it make sense to store them in your office? Or does it make more sense to store them in your kitchen where your appliance is? Because if you're cooking and something happens, do you really want to have to go run upstairs while something may be boiling on the stove? So it makes sense to have things located near where you need them, but you need to know everything you have. So you can do an inventory, which means you go through all your places throughout your house and note what you have in each room, and be wary that you are aware that you could have things stored in rooms that you didn't think about. Records tend to get stashed away. I know sometimes I might walk around and things just, for some reason, I leave something where I wouldn't think about it, and then I find it there later. What's it doing here? And I have cats that knock things around. So you want to find out where everything is, and that includes electronic records. More and more we're getting electronic or digital. The more stuff stored online, so email all your accounts and figure out everything you have. And then you want to sort through them, get out the stuff you don't need, like junk mail. I don't know about you, but when I come inside with my junk mail, I throw it away immediately, but yet it still ends up everywhere. Because it just, I don't know, can't get rid of it. And so get rid of the stuff you don't need that's not a record. You know, those magazines that get stashed in with your records that you've already read or you're not going to read. And then start going through your records and organizing them. All of your records have a retention that you have to keep them a minimum amount of time. I'm not going to tell you what that time is because I don't want to get into the legality of that. But if you talk to an accountant or a lawyer or do some research online, as genealogists, I'm pretty confident you know not to trust just what you read online. You know to do your research about the past or about the history of that website, who put it out. You know, if you go to irs.gov, you can feel pretty confident what they say on there to keep. If you go to Mary Sue's School of Accounting, might not be so confident. So do your research and see how long you have to keep things, and then weed out what you don't need, shredding it. Of course, you don't want to just toss it in the garbage. Some areas have shred days where you can bring your shredding material to them and they'll shred it for you. But make sure it's shredded because you don't want people stealing your information. You also want to do this with your electronic files. It's very easy to forget about electronic files. And people are like, well, they're there, whatever. Get rid of them if you don't need them. That takes up storage space. And then today with cybersecurity, more stuff that you have on your computer, the more at risk you are at people stealing it if they get to your computer. And then you want to organize it. Make sure whatever organizational scheme you use, you know, whether it's you store everything in alphabetical order no matter what it is, or if you group, you know, utilities together and all your different utilities, and then you do your different checking accounts or different bank accounts. However you do that, make sure everybody in your house uses the same one. If you have two people who are using, you know, putting records in the same place and they're using two different schemes, you're quickly not going to be able to find your records. And somebody's going to get mad. And then somebody's going to have to hear that conversation. It's not fun. So make sure you have it organized, and you may want to just keep that year's records in your desk drawer. And at the end of the year, maybe the end of the calendar year, after you get rid of or after you do your tax return, move the rest of them to where your other records are and weed out the ones that can be destroyed. And that way you're going through a yearly process and not backlogging. You want to make sure you're storing your records in a good environment so they're not damaged. Now with archives, we'll talk about how you should store it in a certain amount, certain temperature, certain humidity. And then we all laugh because it's Georgia and that's not going to happen. But for records in your home, basically, if you keep your house, you know, in the 60s or 70s, the humidity's okay, your record should be pretty good. You don't have to have a vault quality house. You know, that electric bill will be insane, but your records should be good in that environment. And that, of course, is both your electronic storage media and your paper and photos. You don't want to store your records in areas where there's no climate control, because the heat will speed up the destruction of the records because of the paper or the storage media itself. The chemicals in them will speed up and break down quicker. If you've ever kept a CD in your car for a long period of time and you start playing it, it'll start skipping things. This will happen with your files as well if they're on a CD, and you'll no longer be able to access them. So some places people put records in that they shouldn't, ideally, are places like basements. And these kind of places I understand because it's not places you usually go to, so it makes sense, but they're still not best. So basements can be humid, flood. There's lots of chances that you could have a water break somewhere. They get bugs in them, and it's just not, records mold in there. They can mold in there without even, extra water being added. Attics can get very hot. Hurricanes or other storms can take the roofs off, as we've seen this past week. My parents live in Florida, and I think it was Irma dropped a pine tree branch on the house. They heard it hit, and then it fell to the ground. They didn't think anything about it for a while. It was over a part of the attic, a part of the house that nobody really goes to. And so you can't get to that area in the attic. It looked like it wasn't a problem, but there was a small little, hole in the roof, and they didn't find out about that until it started leaking into the house. So it had already gone through the attic and into the house, and that's not ideal if you have records there. You can also get little critters there, bugs and who knows what. I've had squirrels run through my attic before. That was kind of not fun. What are you all doing up there? Please don't come downstairs. And my parents, again, going back to them, my mom is one of those people that if it was up to her, the house would always pass the white glove test. She does not like messy houses. So you can imagine how horrified she was when they found rat droppings in the attic. The whole concept of like rats and mice getting into homes just was foreign to me growing up because we weren't allowed to keep a messy house or messy rooms. What had happened was the neighbors had been working on building a mother-in-law suite for years. And they had this construction dumpster outside, and it hadn't been emptied for years. And they had added all the construction debris and food and all that. So it became a stew that rats would like, people wouldn't. And so I guess one day a rat was like, ooh, looked out, well, what's in that house? And across, got up in there. Oh, nothing here. And then, but he left his remains, proof that he had been there. Luckily, he had only stayed for temporarily, but that can happen. So you do also want to make sure, you don't get friends like that in your records, so don't put them in attics. Another reason is most attics are not finished. So the floors are either you have insulation or you might have plywood down. Well, the records are not going to, they're heavy, and eventually the records might go from being in the attic to being in the floor beneath. And if you're beneath them when they fall, that's not good. But also you don't want that to happen to your records. So not in the attic. Sheds also are not good. Sheds, and this is actually a garage. And not only are they not climate controlled, they're usually not as secure because doors are left open, people can come in. But even here, it's organized, but you can see they have gardening supplies in there. And you can bring in bugs that way, and bugs can easily get into that filing cabinet, even though it's closed. Yeah, wonderful chemicals. So for me, I'm just going to the store and buying plants. I've come home with frogs. Like, great. Luckily, it's the little green ones that are cute. I had a plant that I got it out of its pot, the fancy pot they sell it in that you don't use because you're putting it in the ground. And there are like 3 slugs on it. I don't want slugs near my records. I really don't want them near me. You want to make sure, also, don't store them on your porch. I have seen people store them on their porches. Don't do that. I don't know why. I know why not store it there. I don't know why people store them on their porches. You want to make sure they're secure. So even if it's just you and your spouse, you should lock your filing cabinet, and not leave the key with it. That way, if somebody breaks into your house, it makes it just a little bit more difficult for them to get to your records. 10 years ago, my house was broken into. Luckily, it was just punk kids who didn't know anything about records, but they did a wonderful job of making a mess of my records and shredding my sentimental stuff, but they made a mess and it took a couple hours to put them back in order. But had they not been punk kids, they could have come in and stolen important records. And then you want to have backups and copies. And for backups, you most likely the ones doing your backups, which is good because you have control to make sure that it runs, and you want to check that it runs. There is a local government agency that will remain nameless who had their records ransomed a few years ago. And so while the FBI, GBI was dealing with the ransom part of it, they still need to operate. Well, their backup had run the day before or something, and they thought, okay, we'll just go and pull our backup. We'll have to redo a couple days of work, but that's fine. Their backup was done through a contract with a third-party vendor they'd had for 18 months, and they found out the vendor had never done their backup, which that's a really bad time to find out that your backup hadn't been there, and that's something you think about when you have disasters I'm going to talk about later on. Some things that you think are definitely there and should be there might not be there. So they had to pay the ransom to get their records so they could function. Now, doing this yourselves, you should be backing up yourselves and being able to check and make sure. You want to store your backups away from your computer. That way, if something were to happen to your computer, like just physically happen to it, your backup isn't there. Obviously, you don't want to store your backup on your computer or attach to it somehow, because there goes the backup if something electronically goes wrong. And you want copies of your most important records, and I'll talk about that in a little bit later. So a huge part of records management for you all will be disaster planning. And it was unfortunately convenient of Ian to bring home the importance of this. Whenever I talk about, give this kind of presentation, hurricanes like to make an appearance. I'm bad luck. I don't think my parents appreciate it being in Florida. So you have some common disasters in in Georgia. Fire, and as genealogists, hold on, I see what's going on. Okay. We're getting the advancing part wrong. There's an extra step that I'm not used to. So as genealogist, this picture, you'll find out is not something it will make you heartbreak when you hear about it. So I was working in a different state at the time, and when I visited this, what had happened, a county courthouse was too full to keep all of its records. So they got a shed, but one of the nicer sheds. I don't know how, I have a name, I think I know what the name is, but I'm afraid to say it and be wrong. And they had all the climate controls, they got nice shelving for it, and they stored their records that did not fit at their facility there. And only was for the records. They had a few keys to select staff who had a reason to be there. No bathrooms, no kitchen facilities. It was just for the records. Well, one of the people who had the keys had a friend who just got out of jail, had no place to live. So naturally, he assumed that he could stay at the records place, because why not, right? Let's put somebody who just got out of jail with court records and with records in general. Well, as I said, that wasn't really made for living in. So he had to eat and got a portable gas kind of grill thing and turned it on, started cooking his food and left. It burned the facility down. And they took care of the fire, and the administrative office of the court said, we don't have any records there, we don't care. The probate office said everything that we had there was scanned by the Genealogical Society of Utah, Family Search. So it's okay, we have the information. This is 6 years after the fire. They just let it all sit there. None of the metal shelving was left, and a lot of the metal of the shed was gone because people had been coming by and stealing it. All this had been exposed to the climates, but you can still come in and identify some of these records. And my colleague and I were looking, and we saw records that said Administrative Office of Courts, but they said they didn't have records there. And then the probate, these were, wills, marriages, all that type of records. My colleague knew all the cutoffs by heart for the Genealogical Society. These weren't scanned. And so these are obviously very important genealogy records, but you could have marriage license in here, things for people who were still alive and now they're gone. Because even though you can identify them, there's black mold and other hazards. You could still smell the gas there. So there's no way to salvage these records. But so that's a heartbreak, but this stuff happens with fires. You can lose stuff like this. Had they taken action immediately, taken responsibility, they could have salvaged a lot of their records. And that's something important to think about with your records. If you do have a fire, the sooner you react, you might be able to, the sooner you can, or more possibly, save your records. We have floods, of course, tornadoes. So this upper picture comes from Coleman, Alabama. I'm not sure if that's a house or a business that was, or a house that was turned to a business. Now the tornado was kind because up here, that right there is their filing cabinet. So it left their, here's your records. Of course, I'm not sure you really want your records sitting on top of your building. People walk by, they could steal them. So imagine if that was your house, what would you do? What records would you need? And then you have all these different types of water problems that can happen. I've talked about tropical systems, strong storms. They can cause damage to your roofs. They can flood houses. The house my grandparents used to live in Florida, there were 2 major hurricanes go through, and fortunately they were not there at the time, but they had 3 feet of water in it both times, and there's catfish in there. So you can imagine 3 feet, you're going to have a lot of records at that level. Of course, winter and ice storms. The 2014 ice storm, I was living in Montgomery at the time, and Montgomery would say thank you to Birmingham and Atlanta for taking the heat off of them for their poor reaction to the ice storm, because Montgomery didn't do very well either. I had somebody who used to live down the street from me. It was an elderly lady who had passed away, and nothing had been done with her house yet. Her family was coming the following spring to go through stuff. Well, her pipes burst during the winter, and nobody came in and checked. So by the time the family got there, there was nothing salvageable. So I don't know what all was in that house, but just seeing what was in the dumpster outside, the family lost a lot of family records. They had to gut everything, and it's just tragic to think about what they all lost. So you really want to know where all your water sources are. It actually is working now, okay. But not advancing on the computer. Oh well, we're good. So I've already talked about poor climate control and pests. Lots of pests like to, either they're 4-legged, 6-legged, 8-legged, 2-legged. They like to do something. Pests, humans can steal. Rodents like to make nests in your records. Bugs will eat them. I've seen records that have had the bookworms. I don't know if that's an official term, but the ones that go in there and burrow through, that's just gross, but you don't want those in there. And then we get to technology ones. So up here I have some floppy disks. I'm sure we all remember all these different floppies. If you have records on those floppies, you're going to have trouble accessing them because computers these days obviously don't have floppy drives. They don't even have CD drives. And then so that's technologically obsolescence. You have the material, you just can't get to it. And then even if you can get to it, what format is it in? So for example, we had a project here that I worked on a few years ago from an agency that sunsetted in 2002. And they had floppy drives or floppy disks. Well, I didn't have a floppy disk on my computer, of course. We do actually have a USB floppy drive, thankfully. To be able to really look at the files, though, I needed an older version of Word because some of these came from like 1990, so pre-95. And I had a computer that had 97 installed on it, so I could see the records that way. But when I put them on my computer, 2016 put all this weird coding in there. It was kind of similar to back in the 90s when your computer wouldn't talk to your printer and it would just print out smiley faces at you. It's like, thanks. Your printer was just making fun of you But that coding is a problem because it hurts it messes the authenticity of the record, but it also with the usability and usability is that coding hiding anything that we need to know. Fortunately, at the archives, we have a program that manages our permanent electronic records, and it normalizes a lot of the older formats, which means it can recognize that code and display it as it would have been displayed. Most of us can't do that. We're not going to buy something super expensive like that. So if these were records that we needed, we would have lost them because we just couldn't access them. And then a further problem happened. I had gone through everything and I just wanted 6 months later to come back and look at it. It's always good to just get a fresh look. And in that time, a quarter of those floppies had degraded so they wouldn't work anymore. And so that's another problem is you want to make sure you move stuff before things degrade. And then we come across cybercrime, which is one of the biggest crimes or concerns we have nowadays. So up here we have my little cyber criminal. This is Delilah, my cat. And she's doing something innocent here. But there was one time she was on the computer. She got on the computer, she just opened up. And we always kept our history clean. We deleted everything. We didn't have passwords saved on all our browsers, just being overly cautious. She got on a browser we never used, got to YouTube, and was watching her favorite video. Like, how did you do that? She also managed to get on one of my favorite sites that I buy clothes and got a cardigan that she'd picked out in my size, but not a color that works for me, and put it in the shopping cart. Thankfully, it was not Amazon, because one click and I would have had that at my house. I'm glad I don't have to explain to Amazon how that happened. Now, that's all fun and dandy. But it wasn't so fun when I was on YouTube and all of a sudden somebody took over YouTube from me that wasn't at my house. And it's like, who are you? What's going on? Why can't I control YouTube? Why are you searching? So I resolved that by taking the battery out of my computer because I didn't want them doing whatever they were doing on my computer. And now, luckily, I knew somebody was on the computer. You don't always know when people are on your computer. There have been stories of people who have had criminal information. I'm not going to go in detail about it, but stuff they're not supposed to have on their computer that was planted on there by cyber criminals, and the police found out that it was on their computer and they're the ones who got arrested. Plus you have people who are, of course, after your information. Information is, money. They should have better jobs, I think, but it's easier for them to be criminals, I guess. And then you have to worry about power surges. Even if you have power strips, it's best during storms and that kind of, when your power could do something weird, to just unplug everything, because you could still have the power get too strong and fry your system. So essential records, those are the records that if you have a disaster, you absolutely want to make sure these records are ready for you before the disaster hits, as well as afterwards. And I'm going to go through them individually. So they're records that are necessary to respond to or recover from a disaster. Obviously, if you have a disaster, you got to react. If you're living in Fort Myers, you're not going to just wake up tomorrow and everything's going to be fine and dandy. So you want, if you're going to live in a place that's likely to evacuate, you want to have multiple evacuation routes and shelter information. So growing up in the East Coast of Florida, we had 3 routes. We'd either go to Tampa, Orlando, or head to Georgia. We didn't want to go south because that would be affected. We didn't really want to stay in the northern part because likely it would head up the coast, because usually with storms hitting Florida, they curve. And you want to know shelter information, ideally multiple shelters. My daughter lives in Tampa, and when they were trying to evacuate this past week, they turned out not to be able to go to any shelters because they were all full. So they had to ride out the storm in their house. And they're about a mile north of the bay, which thankfully everything was okay, but it would have been nice if they had been in a shelter. You want your identification records, photo ID and address. So if you're evacuating to a shelter, you got to need to prove that you need a shelter. And they're not going to just let anybody come. I mean, people probably would show up that didn't need to stay there. And disasters, people come, like, I don't know, kind of like disaster tourism. Just strange. And so prove that you're there. Even if you're not going to a shelter, say you're going to a hotel. I've known of hotels that when they know people are evacuating to their area, and maybe they don't have shelters, like my hometown didn't used to set up shelters unless it was a disaster was declared there. But the hotels, what they would do is if somebody came from an evacuation zone, they would drop their rates. And if they didn't allow pets, they would allow pets, or they would reduce fees, just really anything to help people who are evacuating. And on a lighter side, when we had Matthew, I think it was, the Braves, if you showed that you were from an evacuation zone for Matthew, they let you come for a free game, which is nice. If you have a disaster heading your way, it's nice to have something to not think, take your mind off of it. You want to have your insurance records, of course, contacts for repairmen. You want to get the repairmen out there as soon as possible. As I said, they can salvage stuff as quickly as possible. The sooner the people are there. Also, if you have widespread disaster, everybody's calling. So in 2004, my parents, in the second storm that hit, they lost their screen enclosure over their pool, which compared to whatever a lot of other people went through, it wasn't a big deal, but they don't have a fenced-in yard, and that took away the biggest protection from anybody getting in their pool. You don't want kids falling in or anything. They didn't want kids, drowning. So they just had that orange fancy material that is not that strong. When they called to get the screen set up, now this is October 2004. Their initial appointment they were given was for like March 2019, because everything was scheduled for 15 years. Luckily, they got it up in 6 months, because as more people come in, my dad does general contracting, and so they took away people from building the new houses to helping with repair. But you want to get on that list. Also, you want contact information for government agencies, especially if you've evacuated, so you need information about what's going on the ground. Bear in mind that some agencies might be helping with response and recovery that might not normally be doing so. So in 2011, when they had the tornado outbreak in Alabama, my grandparents lived in Blount County, which is just north of Birmingham. They're 99 years old. They lived in a mobile home in the middle of the woods. We couldn't get through to them. So we were getting a little nervous, right? You could understand. And the agency handling the coordination of sending out emergency responders, people to check on them, was the county courthouse. Obviously, they weren't having court cases, so they took on that responsibility. So you want to have a variety of government contacts just to help you know what's going on. Now, luckily these days, lots of that information is on the TV, but it's always best to have it with you. Next are the ones to protect your health, safety, property, and rights. And if you look at a lot of this, you'll say, surely somebody has this. The government agency, a business would have this. But as I already showed you with the place that got ransomed and then no backup, you always want to make sure that you have your copy, because who knows, that's a disaster is usually when you find out that your plans and the people who have your records plans, things fell through. So you want to have it with you. You might have had to evacuate and you ran out of your prescription medicine, so you want to be able to prove that you can get your prescriptions. Now, if you go to a large chain, they have that information, but still good to have it with you. I've already talked about IDs. One thing I didn't mention was when you come back, like at Fort Myers, what they're going to do is right now they have the people responding, rescue response for people who have gone through that. They're going to have the people, utilities, people making sure things are safe. And then they're going to start bringing in residents. They're only going to accept people who can prove that they live there. Because, as I said, tourism. People love to go to disaster zones and just walk around and take photos and loot. They don't want to deal with that. So you need your ID to get back in, possibly. You want, having your other licenses can help as well. As I said, my dad's a general contractor. In '98, there was a major hurricane heading their way. And my hometown has a mainland and then barrier islands. And my dad does a lot of the work on the barrier islands. So as there was planning, they got the house secure, they got his job site secure, as well as older homes he had worked on in the past, because it's mainly winter folk or winter birds. So he promised to take care of their homes. My other set of grandparents lived on the barrier island, and they were the last ones. Last thing they were going to do was get my grandparents so they could be at home, get things set up. They're going to go over there, get their house ready. By then, they had cut off anybody going over. So fortunately for my dad, being a general contractor who had his contractor's license and proof that he had work that he did on the island, he was able to go over and get them. Otherwise, my grandparents would have been stuck on the island. Fortunately, the hurricane turned, but still, it was a little close. And then I had a neighbor growing up who was this licensed architect in London. And so his file when he went to school and everything was in London. Unfortunately, he was licensed in 1930s and only had one file, and it was held, like I said, in London. And what happened in London during World War II? The Blitz. And the building that his record was in was destroyed in the Blitz. And they weren't able to reconstruct everything. And for whatever reasons, he never became an architect. So again, you would think agencies would have this stuff, and of course, it's very different from 1940s, but always have your information with you. Of course, don't forget your pets. So they have rights too. So photos and microchips. I can't tell you how many times we've seen hurricane storms and people have their pets are loose, and you hear the stories of the rescue groups coming in. I remember after Katrina, they were, when they were busing people from New Orleans to Houston, somebody tried to get on with the dog. The people said nope and just put the dog down. I personally been like, I'm not getting on. I'm staying with my cats. But still, you can have tornadoes and you lose your pet. So microchips and photos can help you relocate your animal. Proof of vaccinations. I know at least for cats and dogs, if you have a snake, I can't help you. I don't think they get vaccinated anyways. I don't know about the other animals. So if you have you can't prove that they've been vaccinated, the vet is going to assume that they haven't been vaccinated. So they have to restart the whole thing. So for like cats, there's a series of vaccinations. I think like 3 different ones they have to get. Your pets have rights to not get stuck multiple times. Your vets have rights to not have to stick angry cats multiple times or angry dogs. You need prescriptions and medical records. So the calico and the white and orange one, Zoe and Hans, who unfortunately are no longer with us, had diabetes, and so they had to have insulin with them as well as their syringes. Well, syringes could also drug paraphernalia, and I needed proof that I wasn't, walking around with syringes for some, illegal activity. And so I'd have to have that. And Miss Tuxedo, who is also unfortunately not with us, she had feline leukemia. She wouldn't have been allowed in a shelter. Fortunately, the Siamese is still with us, but he'd be too nervous in a shelter. He'd be going to my parents' house. Although with how many cats I have, I don't think my parents would be thrilled. Might have to reconsider that. But yeah, you want to make sure you have all their information. And you want to know what shelters and hotels allow pets. Again, some hotels may override their usual pet policies. So we get into ones that you all are familiar with as genealogists. Photos, scrapbooks, letters, family Bibles, diaries, home videos. Ones that you wish that every ancestor you'd had kept some of these. It would make doing genealogy a lot easier. And so these records you don't want to lose. They have the history of your family and give you your family identification. And for me, one record that falls under this are the letters that you see on the screen. These are the letters that my grandfather and great uncle wrote home during the war to my grandma. Now, there may be some, you could stretch it, historical significance to it. My great uncle, my grandmother's brother, was in the first class of UDT, which is the underwater demolition teams, the predecessor to today's SEALs. So there might be something interesting because, being first class and the work they were doing. Unfortunately for him, just a side note, that he was in the first class because that was done in 1941. Had he not been in that, he would have been on the Arizona. So we're very happy he was a SEAL or a UDT member. My grandfather was a tank repairman, and so apparently they had this secret weapon with their unit that to the point where if they ever went out in public, they would had another military person follow along to make sure they didn't share that information. So there might be some information in his letters that might seem interesting, but mostly it's more interesting to my family and myself. So for these folks, I haven't read all of these letters. The letter I was looking for was D-Day. And if you read it, he was sitting on a boat because obviously the tanks weren't ashore yet. No reason to have him go ashore. I'd heard some stories about it. And it said, if anything were to happen to me, so maybe historians are like, oh, he was concerned something could happen, which obviously at that point, who wasn't concerned? But D-Day was also the 10th anniversary, wedding anniversary for my grandparents. And he wrote, if anything were to happen to me, the only regret I would have is I did not ask you to marry me within a month of meeting you, which is like, oh, sweet. And I mean, you think about people doing all these grandiose romantic things. No, that's more romantic than what a lot of people do. So I would have these going with me. So if you have things like this, these are definitely records you want to make sure you don't lose. And for some of these, like the letters, I could scan them, but there's still also, they have value to me being in their original format. So I would keep the original format. And then as genealogists, you all recognize this type of record, of course. And your genealogy research and your personal research do qualify as records that are essential to take with you. You have put a lot of work into these records, you know, all those hours and money, tracking everything down. As you know, if you just took your charts and you didn't take the backup material, you'd lose all that. You could lose membership to like DAR because you need that. You need to be able to prove stuff. You know, you can't just say, this is what's my family. They're going to say, where's the backup proof? So you don't want to lose that. Some of that stuff may not be around anymore, the primary sources, because you might have gotten it before the courthouse burned down or something. So we do recognize that this information is essential. So some ways to protect, and some of this is going to go back to what I talked about earlier with managing. So you want to identify your essential records. If you have a disaster coming, you want to be able to grab them and run with them. Or if you've had a disaster happen, you want to know where you focus your attention. You don't want to lose your genealogy research and save your credit card bill. Your credit card company will happily mail you a new credit card bill, I assure you. In fact, in 2004, when one of the hurricanes did come through, the postal sorting place in my hometown was damaged, actually destroyed. And some of the bills didn't make it. So my parents missed out on some of their bills. And with everything going on, you know, they completely didn't think about it. So when the next bill came and they said they had owed a late fee, all they had to do was call up the credit card, say we live, you know, here, and the credit card company took care of it. Can't always promise they're going to be like that, but you can hope. But yes, save your essential records first. And identify potential hazards to your records. I've talked about, you know, one thing, not putting them in locations without climate control and security, but know what's in the walls around your records. So there are some places I've been where, you know, say their records room was here and they had the records up against the wall in their metal filing cabinets. No problem, except for there's a bathroom on the other side and the pipes burst in the wall and the water came this way too. So try to know where your plumbing is, because you can have it burst in the wall and you can have water in your records. Don't put them near windows or doors. You can have disasters that break your windows. Things can flood. It's not a good time to find out the ceiling on this actual ceiling, SEAL, is not working on your windows. Also, you know, pest management. Make sure you keep track of how many, you know, bugs that you might see. You start seeing a lot of bugs, you know, get somebody out. Of course, I think we would all do that anyways. Make sure you don't have anything that's going to attract mice, rats, hopefully no squirrels in the attic. They do get there. Call somebody if you have that problem. You want to store your records 6 inches off the ground at least. And that's just if you have it as water, that way you have a little bit of a leeway in case it floods. Ideally higher, but something at least to protect your records. Store them in acid-free containers in metal filing cabinets or shelving. If you do have to use wood, put polyurethane over that. And the idea behind all this is everything's acidic. You don't want to add more acid to it because it just increases the breakdown. And with acid-free containers, of course, we got to be careful. When scrapbooking became a big thing, companies that sold boxes were like, hey, we can make more money by making our box look a little bit better and put archival quality on it. And it's not really archival quality. It's still not acid-free. So make sure it truly is acid-free. And these are definitely for the boxes or the records that you want to make sure last a long time. Fireproof containers. Be wary though, fireproof does not mean heat-proof. I have seen records that combusted inside of fireproof containers. The fire didn't get into it, but the heat around it just caused the records to combust. Manage your records. Of course, you can't identify your essential records. You can't know what your issues are if you're not managing them. You also don't want to have all those extra records because that puts your records at risk because you're trying to take care of all that stuff and probably trying to shove it into as small space as possible. Have multiple copies, multiple locations, multiple formats, and keep them current. If it's an important enough record that you want to keep it, you want to make sure you do all this. If you have multiple copies, you could store the copy elsewhere. Like maybe you have family that lives in a different state that you trust. and you can keep that copy there. Maybe that's where you evacuate to. That way, if something were to happen to your house, you would still have the information. You could have them in, what are those called? Safety deposit boxes. If you have them in paper and electronic, that way, maybe you use the paper a lot, but if you're evacuating, it's a lot easier to grab a hard drive, portable hard drive, than a box of paper. And that way you also have more room in your car or vehicles for other stuff that is sentimentally valuable. And of course, you want to keep them current. Outdated information is not going to help you. You want to back up your records, of course, and migrate records to new software and hardware before you have issues. Periodically check your records, especially if your records are stored in places you don't go often, because one of the biggest threats actually is, things that happen that you don't see. It's easy to forget about your records until you go into a record area a year later and discovered you had bugs in there or a leak happened. And periodically check your electronic records to make sure everything's okay. Even things such as small updates to your computer can cause issues sometimes. I've worked with databases that the computer had a minor update and it undid a lot of stuff in my database. Thank you, because now I have to figure out what the problem was, or what got changed. You want to take your essential records with you, and you can have a grab and go bag, and this includes your essential records, but it also includes things that you want with you, such as changes of clothes, your medication, cash, things to have just in case you're leaving. 3-day supply, might have food and water. Even if you're evacuating, for example, my parents had to evacuate from my hometown to where I was living on the West Coast, which is normally about a 3-hour drive. But because when they were evacuating, they were doing, they didn't do contraflow, so the 2-lane road was one way out, and they should have turned it so both ways were going out, because nobody was coming in except for a few cars, and they were going to go loot or surf. I don't understand. We had a hurricane once that had 3 deaths. All of them were surfers. I don't understand surfing in a hurricane, but the 3-hour trip, because they're so backed up, turned into a 9-hour trip. And they actually did pass somebody whose car was an elderly couple, and their car had burned because it overheated. But even if it doesn't overheat, you're stuck in a car for 9 hours. And you might get thirsty and hungry and want that stuff with you. So I don't really go in detail with recovery methods. That's Sigourney's area, our conservator. Don't tell her that. Carl made that mistake. She says, I deal with records, not trees. She deals with the trees in a different form. But remember, your records may not be lost if you act immediately. Now, if your records are a pile of ash, can't help you. That's just, they're lost. But you could have, say your records are just a clump of waterlogged paper. If you get to somebody out there who is a salvage company and they're used to that kind of stuff, they might be able to salvage it because there are ways to freeze it and then dry it out. If it's something small, you might be able to dry it yourself, but don't just automatically assume it's gone. But do realize that water can turn into mold within, I'm almost there, within like 48 hours. You don't want black mold growing on your stuff. And then these are some resources. So you have ReadyGov, which is national, and then R1, readygeorgia.gov, FEMA, and then we have, of course, the archives. We have caring for your records on there. And then how to make a grab and go bag. But these are some good sites to start looking at. They're going to be also, if there's a disaster, they're likely to be updated for the disaster to give you more information. Well, we're not going to give you more information on evacuation routes, but you can get caring for your records. And that is everything. And if you want, you can email me and I will send you the webinar, or not the webinar, the slides. So any questions? You have 3 minutes. I'm always the one standing in the cold before lunch.
I will add that on our
preparing for records page, in addition to the essential records document, we do have information about companies that specialize in retrieval and care for records that have been damaged. And some of that is directed towards local governments, but there's also some useful information if you do have a major disaster or even a minor disaster.
And there's actually, for the next few weeks, the information, the disaster plan came from a larger course that we give to government agencies. And that information is up there right now because we're going to have the webinar soon. So you can look at that for a couple of weeks. Did you have a
So
question?
my quick question is, I'm overwhelmed with what I have to do. And it takes so much time.
Right.
So what is your professional advice on how to manage our time?
Mhm.
I mean, like do 15 minutes a day or do 30 minutes a day or set aside a week? I mean, it's what you're saying is so much.
Right.
What advice do you give to do what you're saying?
It depends on how you as a person works, but somebody like for me, I'm not good at starting something and then moving on very quickly. So I'm very good at having huge chunks of time so that I could accomplish. So say I was going through and identifying what disasters could potentially be a problem in my house or what risk could be in my house. I would do that all in a day. That way I'm thinking about it. I might come back another day later just to check it, but I would try to get each part done at a time so that I can cross it off. It might take a couple of days.
It's easier just to it's just to take care of it.
And then they curse your
And you need those records and they're not there, then you have a problem.
Yeah.
One thing that I would do with records, not necessarily preparing for a disaster, but around the first of the year, and often New Year's Day was a good day to do that, would be to go through the records from the previous year and either move them to another place or destroy those that I didn't need. And it is something you want to think about with financial records. Do you really need that financial information in your house in case there is a break-in, or if your computer is hacked? And I know someone whose personal computer was hacked with ransomware. So it happens to others than just corporations.
Mm-hmm.
But if you can maybe pinpoint a day every year or every quarter to go through those, maybe every quarter or month, to make sure your backups have been done and that's adequate. And then once a year to review your records on an annual basis to figure out what you need and what you don't need to have. How many of you have all of your tax returns from the beginning of time? You don't need them. And why leave that information around, either for somebody else to go through after you're gone or for someone who does not need that information to get hold of? And I would say the stories that I hear on the reference side and archivist are people who have had water damage, more than fire, I would say.
I think, yeah.
These can be very minor incidents, and that if your records are near that area, they're gone. Storage facilities are especially bad about being built often in low-lying areas, and those can flood. So that's something to keep in mind about what you put into your storage areas, and make sure you know what is there, and if it's something you really that you really have a sentimental or financial attachment to, that's probably not the best idea.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, my parents, thankfully, didn't have records underneath it, but they had their ceiling cave in because the AC unit above it, the water pan, drip pan, got clogged and it fell. Of course, that would be my closet it fell into and my stuff, but it wasn't records, and at least the stuff in there was salvageable. So
another thing you might want to try to think about and maybe get some advice on is if what you have is a copy, what's the agency or the company that has that? Do they have electronic copies such as your credit card bills that you can easily get them? If it's your marriage record that is in a county courthouse, you need to have a backup for that. I've had to deal with many people who don't have proof of marriage and name change. And they're trying to find the license, and they've got to have the license to prove it. And they can't do it. Don't count on the state to have a statewide index of your marriage and to have a copy of the marriage license. That's going to be, at least in Georgia, up to the county court.
And courthouses burn, unfortunately, more than you think.
If it's a major disaster, your county courthouse may be affected with it. That's my lecture. Okay.
Yes.
Well, go ahead.
Any recommendations for already been damaged? Like something with mold, but you don't want to get rid of it because it's the original.
It's more of a Sigourney thing, unless
That would
you.
be more of a Sigourney,
You're right.
particular question.
Because she would.
We can hand out our business card.
Yes. Sigourney likes to answer questions. I have a suggestion, but that's probably not what to do and probably put you more at risk. Any other questions? Did you have a question?
Well, I was just wondering what would be your rate to just move in and take care of it?
Well, at the record center, we charge $30 an hour, but can you tell some agencies that? They don't know that sometimes. Like $30? Yes.
With the annual hourly rates going up.
Yeah. Oh, yes. Trying to get temps is hard. Well, thank you all. I hope you enjoy your lunch and the rest of the day.
Yes, thank you.